The wind howled outside of the cave, and the cold air bit at Lars and Hans as the two brothers faced each other, still surprised by the threat and demand that the Duke had just spat at them. Who does this weasel think he is? Does he not realize who sent us here in the first place? He wouldn't dare do anything to upset the king, Hans thought to himself. Meanwhile, Lars was more concerned with the fact that they had already been discovered after only 2 days of being in Arendelle. "Oh, look at them," the Duke of Wesselton said to his guards as he laughed and pointed toward the two brothers, who were still sitting on the cold stone ground of the cave. "They're so confused." His laugh grew louder. "Wesselton," Hans began to say through his teeth before being cut off by his brother. Lars placed his hand on Hans's shoulder as if to silence him before addressing the Duke for himself. "Duke, sir, allow me a moment, if you will, to talk to my little brother about how we will move forward with this transgression." The Duke smiled. You always were the only one of George's sons that knew how to properly address those who were above them. You may have your little chat, but understand that there is only one real way out of this for you two, and that's by agreeing to my terms." "That's King George to you, sir," Lars said before turning toward his brother. "Excuse me," responded the Duke. Lars looked back at the short-standing man and respectfully informed him, "If I must properly address those that are above me, then you must as well. You are a duke, while George, my father, is king, and you will address him as such." The Duke of Wesselton scowled at Lars, but before he could think of a proper response, Lars continued speaking. "Now, please, give us a moment to talk." The Duke scoffed before answering. Fine, but make it quick, and go over there." He pointed to a section of the cave that was away from him and his guards. "I will not be set outside while you two chit-chat." Hans stood to his feet and was now towering over the Duke. He chuckled as he looked down on the balding man. He then turned and extended a hand to help his older brother up off the floor, and the two made their way to the wall on the other side of the cave entrance. Lars turned to Hans and was about to speak, but Hans quickly cut him off. "I think we should consider his offer, brother." Lars was taken aback for a second before replying. "Why would we do that, Hans? Think about it for a moment." He paused briefly before continuing. "The only reason he wants our help is that if whatever he's planning should fail, the two of us make the perfect scapegoats." "But what if he tells the Ice Queen of our arrival?" Hans asked. "If we teamed up with him, perhaps—" Lars cut him off. "There would be no teaming up with the Duke. He wishes for us to be his dogs and do as he says. And who's to say what he'll do with us once this is all over?" Lars looked back at the Duke and his guards, who were all staring in their direction. He turned his attention back to his brother. "And besides, he can't risk exposing us to Queen Elsa, for if he does, then he risks exposing himself." Hans was visibly confused by this. "Because we will tell her of his plots to overthrow her, Hans," Lars explained. Hans was now the one looking over at the Duke, who was now starting to visibly shiver from the cold. "I don't know, brother. I think we can use him to our advantage." Lars rolled his eyes at this response, but before he could retort, Hans continued speaking. "If he can get us close and help us take down the witch, not only would Arendelle be ours, but we can then turn on him and make him pay for thinking that he can speak to us in that way." Hans began to show a sinister smile, one that made his older brother uneasy. "You're a fool if you think that Wesselton is just going to let you walk away from this," Lars said. "Or you are the fool for thinking that we have a choice in the matter," Hans snapped back. Lars let out a loud exhale. "We always have a choice, Hans. You just have to look for it. Listen to me, Lars. An opportunity like this isn't just going to fall into our laps again. We don't know anyone in the kingdom to help us, and yet here's the Duke offering to give us exactly what Father wants." "But what do you want, Hans?" Lars yelled without realizing that the Duke could hear them. The Duke of Wesselton let out a cough to clear his throat as he took a step toward Hans and Lars. "Well, it appears that you two have some things to discuss. As for me and my men, it's far too cold to spend the rest of the evening in this frigid air. So how about this?" The Duke stepped a few feet away from the two brothers. I'll let you two figure out whether or not you want me to keep it a secret that you're here while we head back to our warm rooms in the city. In the meantime, you will both have until sundown tomorrow to make your decision." Lars and Hans had now turned their attention to the Duke. "When will you be back here?" Lars asked. The Duke let out a small chuckle. "Oh no, I have no intention of coming back here," he said with a tone of disgust in his voice. "You will meet me at a secret meeting place that I have designed for a time such as this." "But how will we know where to go?" Hans interjected. "Tomorrow afternoon you will leave this place heading west. You will continue until you find a small horse trail heading north and south. Take the trail north and you will eventually come across a small wooden hut that I had built the last time I was here with you, boy," he said as he pointed to Hans. The Duke began to make his way to the entrance of the cave, and before walking out of sight with his guards, he yelled back, "And remember, I expect you there by sundown." And with that, he was gone, and the two brothers were alone to continue their squabbling. Without hesitating, Hans was looking back at Lars and was ready to continue their argument. "If he can help us as much as he says he can, I say we hear him out. I will not let our father down again," Hans said angrily. "This isn't about our father, Hans," Lars replied. "This is about you. Listen to me. Do you remember when father sent you here the first time?" Hans scoffed. "How could I forget? I'm constantly reminded of my failure." "No, Hans, it wasn't your failure. It was father's," Lars said. Hans was confused again. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "None of that should have been your responsibility, Hans," Lars began to say. "It's always been our father's mission to get Arendelle under the control of the Southern Isles. That doesn't have to be ours. We don't have to please him with everything that we do." Hans began pacing back and forth as he grew angrier and angrier at what his older brother was saying. "Then why are we even here if not to please father? Why do any of this?" Hans questioned Lars as he stepped toward him. "Because you know what would happen if we had refused," Lars yelled at his younger brother. "You know what he would have done to me. To you." Hans was silent. He couldn't think of any response. All he could do was think back on all the times that his father had raised his hands to him and his siblings. "We know what he used to do to Mother when she would second-guess his demands," Lars continued. "And she's the only person in our household that he's actually claimed to love. So you think about what he would have done to us had I told him that we weren't going to do this for him." Lars looked his little brother in the eyes. "This time I might not have gotten him to stay the executioner axe for either of us." Hans was stunned to learn that he was almost executed for failing his job the first time. Lars could tell that he had made the connection by the look on his face. "Hans, look at me," Lars said. "We don't have to work with the Duke, and we don't have to do Father's bidding anymore. Just give me some time, and I promise you that I will be able to figure everything out. It'll all be fine." Hans looked at Lars for a second before responding. "I won't let him down again." Lars' head fell and he faced the ground as his heart filled with sorrow over his brother's choice. "If you're doing this, Hans, you're doing it on your own." Lars began walking toward the entrance of the cave. "What do you mean?" Hans said. "You'd just leave me here? What about Father's orders?" Lars looked back to Hans. "I'm done taking orders from tyrants, and if I can't help you find another path, then there's nothing more I can do." He continued to leave the cave and walk off into the forest. Hans wanted to chase after his brother with every bone in his body, but for some reason he couldn't bring himself to move or say anything else. Hans sat by himself in the cave's entrance for a while after his brother had left, hanging his head as he thought about his poor mother. After a few moments, he stood up and began pacing around. The sun was now fully visible in the sky, and while Hans had planned on gathering some fish with his brother that day, after their argument, he felt that it would be better for him to give Lars some space. "He'll come around," Hans thought to himself. "He has to see that this is the only way that we can make this work." As the day pressed on, Hans spent most of his time just outside of the cave, pacing back and forth while occasionally muttering to himself, "It's the only choice we have." Every now and then, Hans would hear a sound come from the woods that surrounded him, and every time he had hoped to see his brother's face wandering toward him. Not only was he growing bored, but soon it would be time for them to go and meet the Duke. However, as time continued to pass, there was no sign of Lars. "Where are you, brother?" Hans thought to himself as he looked up at the sky and could see that the sun was beginning to fall from the sky, and knew that it was now or never. "I guess I'm doing this by myself," Hans said as he let out a loud sigh. He began to make his way slowly through the woods. He headed west toward the small trail that the Duke had told them to follow, and as he walked, Hans made sure to keep looking around in hopes of seeing Lars on his way. Sadly, by the time he had reached the trail, there wasn't any sign of Lars, and by that point Hans knew that he was certainly meeting with the Duke of Wesselton all on his own. After finding the trail, Hans made sure that he was following it toward the north and continued making his way to the meeting. It was another half an hour or so before Hans could see the small hut that he had been told about. The sun had nearly set, and Hans could see the small wooden structure sitting in between a grouping of large trees. If he wasn't looking for it, he was sure that he could have walked right by and never even noticed it. He wasn't kidding when he said secluded, he thought to himself. As Hans approached the hut, a small wooden door swung open and one of the Duke's guards stepped out. "Weapons?" he asked. "Excuse me?" Hans replied as he walked up to the guard. "Do you have any weapons? If so, you will leave them outside." The guard was now looking up and down Hans to see if he was carrying anything. Hans was visibly irritated by this. "Do I look like I have any weapons?" he asked sarcastically. "Now let me in. I have a meeting with your master." The guard ushered Hans into the building, which contained a single table with a chair on either side of it. The Duke sat in one chair, and he gestured to the other. "Please, have a seat. I figured that it would be only you, boy. Your older brother seems far too diplomatic to get his hands dirty. But from what I hear concerning your sleeping arrangements back on the Isles, you don't mind getting a little dirty." The Duke laughed as Hans made his way over to the only other chair in the room. Hans sat down and was now facing the Duke of Wesselton. "Enough banter. I've thought about your request for my help. I'm in." "Request?" asked the Duke. "Oh no, my boy, you misunderstand. This is an order, and you will carry it out to the letter. Then and only then can you consider your presence in Arendelle a secret." Hans scoffed as he glared across the table at the Duke. "What is it then?" he asked. "Oh, you're going to infiltrate the castle." The Duke paused before finishing his sentence. "Tonight." Hans sat back in his chair as the anger faded from his face and was replaced with a slightly distressed look. The Duke of Wesselton couldn't help but smirk.